On April 29th, Swedish air defense controllers were surprised to see radar returns from a single Russian plane heading across the Baltic Sea towards Swedish airspace. A pair of Swedish Air Force JAS-39 Gripen fighter jets were scrambled to intercept. Just east of the Danish island of Bornholm, the Russians crossed illegally into Swedish airspace. The Swedes caught up, pulled alongside, took some photos, and then escorted it back toward Russia. The Swedish fighter pilots reported that the plane was an Antonov An-30 Clank. Despite its ironic code name, that plane is a very unique intelligence-gathering asset. It features onboard cameras and electronics designed to generate digital maps for cruise missiles. Nowadays, with satellite photography, you might think that maps like that don't need much updating. But satellite photos don't give you what you need. Cruise missiles fly too low. Hills, valleys, towers, buildings, power lines, and even the heights of trees need to be mapped with absolute precision. That's the sole mission of the An-30. As a result, even if it carries no weapons itself, every flight of that plane constitutes a serious security threat. Incredibly, the side of the plane's fuselage bears the words "Open Skies" painted in big blue letters. That refers to the policies that friendly countries have for each other's airliners to fly freely between their airports. Obviously, that An-30 isn't an airliner. In fact, it's exactly why the skies aren't kept open for the Russians in the first place. The day after the interception, the Swedish Minister of Defense, Peter Hultqvist, made a public statement. He said, "It is completely unacceptable to violate Swedish airspace. We will, of course, mark this diplomatically. The action is unprofessional and, given the overall security situation, it is extremely inappropriate." By that, he was referring to Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine. That flight at the end of April marks a significant change in the Baltics. Over the past few years, the Russians would typically send between 2 and 6 planes on each run against Sweden's borders. Usually, they would send fighters to escort nuclear-armed bombers, including Su-24s and Tu-22s armed with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. For instance, just 1 week after the Russians attacked Ukraine, on March 2nd, 2 Sukhoi Su-27 fighters escorted a pair of Su-24 strategic bombers. They made a high-speed dash against Sweden's borders and even managed to penetrate a short distance before being intercepted. At the time, Sweden's Air Force commander, Carl-Johan Edström, commented, "This demonstrates that our readiness is good. We take this incident very seriously. Russia's conduct is unprofessional and irresponsible." Privately, though, a Swedish Air Force official commented, "They're testing us." Then he added, "We're ready." That wasn't always the case, however. 9 years ago, on March 29, 2013, on the night of Good Friday, the Russians launched a pair of Tupolev Tu-22 backfire bombers from St. Petersburg. They sent along an escort of 4 Su-27 jet fighters. As they were flying down the middle of the Baltic Sea from the north, they were surprised to see that Sweden's Air Force didn't launch any aircraft to intercept them. It seemed that Sweden was at home celebrating the Easter weekend. Taking advantage of the situation, they practiced launching their nuclear-tipped cruise missiles against Sweden's capital city of Stockholm. They only stopped the launch sequence at the point of pulling the trigger. Then they turned to the south. Still seeing no Swedish interceptors on the way, they flew toward the Swedish island of Gotland in the Baltic Sea. Arriving there, surprised that they hadn't yet been intercepted, they flipped a few switches, considered how easy it would be to destroy the town of Visby, and then cruised past the island about 30 kilometers to the east. Even then, they were surprised that there was still no response from Sweden. It was only when they approached the Danish island of Bornholm that a pair of Danish F-16s took off from Šiauliai Air Base in Lithuania. They intercepted the 6 Russian planes. However, it was 2 F-16s against 4 escorting Su-27 fighters that were protecting the Russian bombers. The situation was uncertain, but the Russians simply tipped their hat and finally turned toward home. The following day, there was hell to pay in the Swedish Air Force. The only thing that had saved Stockholm from a nuclear strike was the decision by the Russians to not attack. Sweden's failure that day might seem shocking, but it needs some context. Looking back, Sweden was only surprised because it had only been 18 months since Putin had ordered his air force to start flying again in the Baltic. For more than 2 decades, since the flag had gone down in the Soviet Union, the Russians hadn't flown a single threatening flight. After the Good Friday fiasco, their flights in the Baltic increased to several times a month. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it seemed that the threat had reached its highest point. However, 3 months later, a lot has changed. In its ongoing war, Russia has suffered massive losses. The Russian Air Force is a shadow of what it once was. Counting both fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters, over 450 Russian aircraft have been lost so far. That includes some of Russia's most advanced 5th-generation stealth aircraft, such as the Su-35 and its most advanced attack helicopter, the Kamov Ka-50. Due to international sanctions, Russia's capacity to replace those losses is also at an all-time low. Even prior to when the war began, the country could only build 5 Ka-50s per year. That capacity is even less now. It will take years to replace those kind of losses, if they can be replaced at all. For Russia, it isn't just equipment losses that matter. Hundreds of the country's best pilots have been lost as well. Who will be left to train the next generation of pilots? If Russia continues fighting in Ukraine, it will end up as a second-rate military power. In fact, people are already questioning whether the country should still be called a superpower. Russia has thousands of nuclear weapons, but then again, how many work at this point? It isn't hard to imagine that the very corruption that has undercut Russia's conventional military readiness has had an even greater impact on its rocket forces. That's where the real money is, after all. Or maybe it's in Swiss bank accounts. Russia's nuclear deterrence today is based on the uncertainty not about how many rockets they have, but rather on how many might still work. I think that's the best measure of how far Russia has fallen in the Putin era. While it's hard to answer what Russia has gained from its Ukraine invasion, it's easy to see what it's lost, not only in lives and equipment, but also reputation, status, economic power, financial stability, international influence, and even cultural relevance. Ultimately, when we think about the single An-30 intelligence plane with open skies written on its side, 2 questions come to mind. First, how long will it be before that's the last plane the Russian Air Force has flying? And second, at that point, does open skies apply over Moscow? I'm Thomas Van Hare, and this is Historic Wings. Please subscribe, click like, and consider sponsoring me. And remember, there's always more to the story.